Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It is good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. President Biden is defending the U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan after 20 years of war. This afternoon, he spoke publicly for the first time since the Taliban's swift return to power. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani fled the country over the weekend as Taliban insurgents seized control of the capital city, Kabul. Thousands of American troops are still in the country as the U.S. works to accelerate the evacuation of any remaining American personnel and Afghan aides. Early Monday morning, crowds of Afghan civilians flocked to Kabul's international airport in a desperate attempt to flee. The U.S. Embassy relocated to the airport, and the U.S. ambassador is still there. Earlier, President Biden said the United States' goal in Afghanistan was to prevent a terrorist attack from happening on U.S. soil, and that the mission was never about nation building. However, he did concede the situation deteriorated faster than expected.
I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. That's why we're still there. We were clear-eyed about the risks. We planned for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I would be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated.
After the president spoke, State Department spokesman Ned Price said the U.S. is communicating with Taliban leaders. He had this warning for the insurgent group.
We are working on a couple different fronts. First and foremost, to seek to preserve calm in Kabul, to maintain a semblance of security, and very importantly, to underscore that any effort, any attempt to target, to threaten, to intimidate our personnel or our operations would be met with a swift and decisive response.
The Pentagon also had a press briefing today. Here is one exchange Press Secretary John Kirby had with an Afghan journalist.
Afghan people, they don't know what to do. Women has a lot of achievement in Afghanistan. I had a lot of achievement. I left from the Taliban like 20 years ago. Now we go back to the first step again. Do you have any comment? Where is our president, Ghani? He should answer to Afghan people.
Well, I obviously can't speak for Ashraf Ghani or where he is or what his views are. I wouldn't do that. But let me say with all respect that I understand, and we all understand, the anxiety and the fear and the pain that you're feeling. It's clear and it's evident. And nobody here at the Pentagon is happy about the images that we've seen coming out in the last few days. And we're all mindful of the kind of governance that the Taliban is capable of.
For more, let's bring in CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini. Christina, thanks so much for being with us. So tell us, I know it is a fast-moving situation, but what is the latest on what's happening in Kabul?
So most of our attention right now is focused on the airport, which has really become America's last stand in Afghanistan. Our understanding, thanks to our Pentagon colleagues, Ellie Watson, has reported that those flights have started again. When I came on the air here with you guys, she said that one military flight had landed and another was getting ready to land. Now, that's good news. The less good news is it's still only military flights at this moment. It's not open to commercial flights or to private charters, as far as we know, because it's so precarious and they're still trying to get control of the airfield. Look, as the president mentioned, there are still a lot, tens of thousands of Afghan special immigration visa applicants who need to leave the country because they worked for the Americans over this 20-year war and they fear being killed by the Taliban. CBS News has reported there's a contingent about only 100 Americans from the embassy left. They've formed kind of a fallback embassy at the airport. Ambassador Wilson is there. A source tells me he's refusing to leave, and they have to try to process as many of those applications as they can. But it's complicated. Not only that, but there are about 10,000 civilians, Americans who live and work in Kabul, who need to leave as well. At the moment, the embassy is sealed. There's no one in it, and there's no one to answer the phone. So if you're an American in Kabul and you need to get out, the only way to do it right now is to go on a website and fill out a form and hope that someone someone gets back to you. But these are people's lives. They're essentially emailing into a bureaucratic black hole and hoping it comes out with a confirmation for a flight. People are increasingly stressed. It's increasingly uncertain when they'll be able to get out. And everybody is just waiting to see how long the Americans feel like they can hold that airstrip. At the moment, the State Department is operating under the assumption that they are all going to be ordered out of the country at the end of the month. As it is, that's only 14 days away. That only gives them 14 days to accomplish all of this with very minimal staffing. But it's unclear if they will be able to control that airport for the next 2 weeks.
So that's the diplomatic presence there for the U.S. What about the military presence, Christina? How many U.S. troops are there now in Afghanistan overall? What specifically are they doing there? You mentioned keeping that airport secure.
Well, it's ramped up, right? And originally it was 3,000. They added another 1,000. Now it's about 5,000 there, and there's 1,000 other places around the region getting ready because, these people have to fly out to somewhere, right? They have to set up a facility to receive all these people once they evacuate. The military's main focus right now is on securing that airport. Look, President Biden was very clear in his statement. He's been very clear over the weekend when he issued a written statement defending the policy in Afghanistan, saying the U.S. is not going to fight the Taliban. And he said today, American forces cannot do what Afghan forces would not. He said they provided them with the training and the equipment, but they could not provide them with the will to fight. So their focus is on evacuating Americans and evacuating Afghans who helped Americans who are vulnerable, whose lives are in danger. It's just a matter of whether or not they can accomplish that and how long the Taliban will allow them to maintain control of the airport without forcing a conflict.
Is it clear, with respect to those Afghan aides and interpreters who helped the U.S. forces, is it clear where they might go? You talk about the fact that for Americans, just trying to get any connection to the embassy, you're going to be emailing into this sort of bureaucratic abyss. What about those who are not Americans, those Afghan aides and interpreters that you mentioned?
It's a similar process. There's really no way, there's no one you can call. You just have to keep filling out forms and hoping that someone calls you. I mentioned earlier today, we saw this during COVID, during this big global evacuation that the State Department facilitated. When they started to get that program up and running, they basically said, go to the travel.gov and fill out this form and someone will contact you. It took a long time for that to get up and running, and it was very disorganized and very scary for people at the top because they weren't hearing back from folks. And that's kind of where we are in this process. People are doing what they're told, they're filling out the forms, and they're not hearing back. And part of the reason is because they've had so many problems at the airport. Look, we all saw those images this morning of Afghans running onto the tarmac, of them clinging to the plane, of some of them dying, falling off the planes as they're trying to take off. Ned Price, the State Department spokesperson, just called them heartbreaking. They're really, really hard to watch, but it's also really, really hard to facilitate a massive airlift if you can't control the place those planes need to take off from. So everyone is hopeful that at some point this will get more organized and they will be able to contact these people. But for the moment, it's very precarious and it's uncertain how many they're going to actually be able to get out of the country by the time the U.S. decides it's time to remove its diplomats and the military forces.
All right, a dire situation. Christina Ruffini for us. Christina, thank you.
Thanks, Elaine.
Part of the message President Biden had today is the same one he's had for weeks. Afghans need to fight for themselves. Here's some of what he said about the troop withdrawal earlier this month.
Look, we spent over $1 trillion over 20 years. We trained and equipped with modern equipment over 300,000 Afghan forces. And Afghan leaders have to come together. We lost death and injury, thousands of American personnel. They've got to fight for themselves, fight for their nation.
For more on the response out of Washington, let's bring in Major Garrett, Natasha Korecki, and Marianna Sotomayor. Major is CBS News chief Washington correspondent. Natasha is a White House correspondent for Politico. And Marianna is a congressional reporter for the Washington Post. Welcome to all of you. Major, I want to get your take, sort of a 30,000-foot view question. I mean, last month we heard President Biden announce that the U.S. combat mission in Iraq would be ending by the end of 2021. American troops are staying there under reclassified roles. When you look at that approach, though, to Iraq, as well as the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, Does it tell us something about President Biden's view of American intervention in these conflicts? Because, you know, you had an Iraqi government official, you know, appearing with President Biden, very clearly intending to send a message about the legitimacy of that government in Iraq. Right. And yet those officials are now seeing what is happening in Afghanistan. I wonder what your thought is on that.
Well, they're definitely separate theaters, separate wars, separate interactions between the United States and the sitting government. Remember, Ashraf Ghani, the Afghan president, was in Washington at the White House a couple of months ago also. And in Iraq, we have much more important strategic considerations. Iran just to the east, Syria just to the west, and remnants of ISIS still there. So there is ongoing interest for the United States government in Iraq, and lots of governments have come and gone in Iraq with a somewhat combustible relationship with the United States and U.S. forces there, and they've wanted some clarity about what our abilities were, what the rules of engagement were, and how long we would stay there. All of that the Biden administration has tried to clear up. Getting to Afghanistan, which is by far the most important story for the Biden White House right now, it was clear that this president was going to live up to President Trump's withdrawal. He was going to leave it a little longer than the May deadline, first agreed upon by the Trump administration with the Taliban, but we were going to get out. That decision was going to be made. That decision was made. The one central problem for President Biden is almost everything he has said publicly about the ramifications of that decision and what it set in motion have not held up to history. None of them have aged well. He said just weeks ago, the embassy won't be overrun. We won't have a Saigon situation. He practically guaranteed that. Well, I'm not sure this is precisely a Saigon situation, but it's close enough to be comparable. And this chaotic situation at the airport is not something that happens in a country in which you have a plan that is working. By definition, an international airport that is non-functional and that needs thousands of U.S. military just to protect does not constitute a well-planned evacuation, either of Americans or Afghans. And to pick up on Christina's point from a moment ago, there have been those in Congress and those advising the Biden White House from the outside for months about the dire need to accelerate the processing of Afghans who assisted the United States military within Afghanistan these 20 years, to move the process forward more rapidly, to get it approved at the highest levels of the State Department, to remove bureaucratic encumbrances because those people needed to get out first. Of course, the Americans would be able to get out because when the Taliban saw the U.S. military arrive in whatever capacity, they weren't going to pick a fight with the Americans. But if you don't get the Afghans out, they are going to be targeted. And if the Americans have to leave in a hurry, as we are right now, those Afghans might be left behind. And that is the biggest problem right now I see for the Biden administration. Because if it prioritizes Americans, as it probably will, and all of its rhetoric suggests it has, Afghans will be left behind, and they will be sitting ducks to the Taliban, and retribution will be swift, bloody, and perilous.
So to pick up on Major's point, Natasha, in a new piece for Politico, you wrote that it is the execution of this withdrawal that is being criticized, not necessarily the withdrawal itself. You described it as, quote, a particular failure given it happened under a president who, since the presidential primary, boasted he stood out from the pack because of his 4 decades serving on the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee and his time on the global stage as vice president. So, Natasha, how has the White House been defending its recent actions?
Well, what President Biden did today was sort of obfuscate the what's happening right now. He presented a false choice. He leaned into this whole decision, as Major just laid out. That decision had been made a while ago, the decision to withdraw troops. That's what he leaned into today. And he said he was doubling down on that decision. This is not a war we want to take part in anymore. Yes, most Americans support the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. The problem here is the execution. I mean, just look at the images. This is exactly what President Biden said would not happen under him. As you recall, again and again, during the primary, he promised to be the adult in the room. He promised to bring America back to the world stage. And what we're seeing is in complete contradiction to that. And also, as Major pointed out, he just laid this out weeks ago. So it's really fresh in everyone's mind what President Biden said would never happen. And that is precisely what is happening right now. So, Biden was resolute today, and he did talk about, we can't fight on behalf of Afghans if they don't have the will to fight for themselves. But again, he's presenting a false choice. That the decision here and what's at issue here right now is how the U.S. executed this. And Biden had promised everyone he was going to be the adult in the room. He had this. He had foreign policy. He could handle this. And what we're seeing right now, I think, is the worst days to date for the Biden administration.
Marianna, we have seen members of Congress, meantime, tweet that they are getting inquiries from people in Afghanistan who are desperately trying to get out. What's the reaction that you're seeing from lawmakers to this rapidly unfolding situation in Afghanistan?
That's exactly right. You've been hearing so much from members of Congress who are really trying to help family, friends of constituents that live within their districts in hopes of bringing them back, or also pleading internally with their local government, saying maybe we can try and bring a number of these refugees into our state. Now, there have been a lot of reactions, but most of them really echoing the same thing, which is that this definitely is a perilous moment. America, while we are retreating in some ways from Afghanistan, or we are retreating from Afghanistan, that we are still with the people that helped us along the way, the 20 years that we were there. Many people from, especially Republicans, but also including Democrats, very much saying that what this shows, and if any of the interpreters or anyone else, any Afghan who helped Americans along the way are killed in the coming days, weeks, or potentially months because they can't escape, that is really going to hurt our relationships with foreign nations, simply because they may not be able to trust Americans at their word if they see what is happening, and that they could potentially risk their own lives in helping Americans who at the end of the day may not be there to help them and their families. So that is really something that we're hearing a lot of, and not to mention that Republicans really using this moment to hammer the president, hammer the administration, and say that they haven't been necessarily transparent with them and their own calls, especially those Republicans who have for a long time been warning not only the Trump administration, but also the Biden administration that this would be an outcome. And, something to keep in mind is that these criticisms aren't just going to go away. It's likely to continue as all members of Congress continue to monitor the minute-by-minute developments in Afghanistan.
So I was reading an analysis piece by someone who called this a bipartisan failure, Major, this policy, this withdrawal in Afghanistan. As someone who has covered multiple administrations, Major, remind us what the original U.S. mission was in Afghanistan. How did it evolve under the George W. Bush administration? Where did that evolution of mission then leave subsequent presidents?
Well, Elaine, my experience with this conflict goes back to 9/11 itself, when I was with George W. Bush, then President of the United States, in Sarasota, Florida, the morning that the two jetliners crashed into the two World Trade Center towers, starting the war on terrorism. And I've covered every administration since as it's dealt with Afghanistan. And you asked me a moment ago about the 30,000-foot perspective. Let me try to add one. Look, it's been about since 2012 that this country was intellectually, politically, and rhetorically, and from a congressional oversight level, seriously engaged in Afghanistan. We've basically taken the last 8 years off, not really paying much attention to Afghanistan or the trajectory of whatever we were trying to accomplish there since the last surge of President Obama, which was started at the end of 2009 and carried out through 2010, 2011, 2012. In 2014, President Obama said he was going to withdraw and bring down forces, but essentially, at the congressional level, and certainly at the military level, we have been treading water in Afghanistan. And as we've treaded water, we have sort of given up territory gradually to the Taliban, without anyone really paying attention to the long-term ramifications of that. And if you go back to some phenomenal reporting done in late 2019 by Craig Whitlock at the Washington Post, going back through interviews conducted with those who were in Afghanistan for many years, they say in those interviews that Craig Whitlock wrote about for the Washington Post that since 2003, essentially, American military and diplomatic leaders from all administrations up until current time have essentially been sugarcoating Afghanistan and telling the American taxpayers and the American people it's all going better than it actually was. So I think there is a global failure here within America to understand what we were trying to accomplish in Afghanistan, what the metrics of measuring how much or how little we were accomplishing that goal actually were, and this persistent drift. So President Biden, when he says we can't stay there any longer and expect a different result, he's right about that, because the entire history of Afghanistan, essentially from 2003 to current date, backs that up. As we've discussed, that's a truism, and there's nothing wrong about that. And some president, whether it was Biden or a future president, was going to make this decision. This decision was going to be made. He made it. What I think is becoming a very difficult situation for this White House is explaining the inability to understand the ramifications and better prepare for them. And one other thing I would point out for the Republican critics who are jumping all over the Biden administration, that's what happens in politics. But I don't see them criticizing then President Trump negotiating this deal and coming within a hair's breadth of inviting the Taliban to Camp David itself, which President Trump very nearly did. And so much of this, in terms of the withdrawal and the negotiated settlement with the Taliban that did not involve the Afghanistan government, is partly related to decisions made by former President Trump. So Republicans who want to jump all over President Biden now have some legitimate cause to do so. But they better not forget, or at least they should be reminded, that President Trump set much of this in motion himself.
So, Natasha, on that very point, you've reported that the Biden administration did lay part of the blame for the collapse of the Afghan government on the Trump administration. Can you talk about that a bit more, and particularly what Major mentioned here, this peace agreement back in February of 2020, in which withdrawal was agreed in exchange for, we're not sure exactly what. There was a lot of unknowns at that point about what the actual metric of success would be, and there was a negotiation that took place, but it was never clearly defined what that would look like. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that a bit, because many are pointing to that as a key factor leading up to this moment.
Well, certainly it is, and certainly there's been a lot of criticism now of Trump of legitimizing the Taliban at the time, of talking to them and, coming close to having them here. I think what's important to note right now, though, is I just talked to a pollster today who said during the Trump administration, during the 4 years, he could only find 3 public national polls in which people were asked about Afghanistan. It was nowhere on the radar screen. And certainly not, in the end during COVID and so forth. Now, America is paying attention, and they're seeing all of these events unfold. They're watching it live, and what they don't know is about, when they weren't paying attention during the Trump administration. Well, there's going to be a big learning curve, and the White House, in their messaging, just to politically stay afloat, is really going to have to get in there and explain to people how this came to be. I think we saw Biden do some of that today. He laid it all out. But the fact of the matter, and the troubling sign politically for Biden, is that Americans were not paying attention then. They don't remember a lot of this stuff, but they are watching now, and they're watching the scenes. And we've already seen a couple quick polls that are saying Americans are now doubting, well, should we have, now they're paying attention. Should we have withdrawn? Now, of course, these are snap polls, but I do want to stress that politically this is a very dangerous prospect for Biden and the White House if they don't explain historically what happened and keep hitting home on what really set the wheels in motion here. Of course, the other side of that is we've heard a lot of discussion about, Biden already pushed back the deadline. He could have pushed it back again. Did he set an artificial deadline by trying so hard to have the September 11th nice and neat, 20-year anniversary when maybe it needed more time. Again, it's the question of the policy, and it's the question of the execution of the policy. Perhaps Trump put something in motion. Perhaps he is to blame here as well. And certainly Republicans jumped on board and wanted Americans out of Afghanistan. One after another were saying that. But again, here we are in the present. Here we are in the execution. And that does land on Biden's shoulders. So they will have to do a lot of explaining about how we got to this point politically. But the fact of the matter is there are aspects of this that I think are unspinnable for the White House at the moment.
Clearly, President Biden and his advisors understanding the importance of this moment by coming back to the White House and making that statement, taking no questions from reporters, but understanding, obviously, the gravity of this moment. Major Garrett, Natasha Korecki, and Marianna Sotomayor, thank you all very much.